It began with a scream, a shrill, echoing cry that rang through the opulent marble corridors of the Hotel Véron, slicing through the music of the string quartet playing discreetly in the winter garden. Guests paused, frozen with hors d'oeuvres, half-raised, champagne glasses trembling slightly in manicured fingers. The scream had not come from the reception or the ballroom, but from the private elevator near the penthouse floor, exclusive, reserved for only the wealthiest patrons. The scream was followed by silence, a silence so complete it felt like a held breath across all 5 floors of the hotel. Then the bell rang. Not the chime of a service bell, nor the soft tones of a maître d' calling for attention. This was the bell of the antique concierge desk, an old brass contraption, rarely used now, preserved as a relic from the hotel's founding in 1882. It was the bell that the bellboys once rang when a guest's carriage arrived at the front, or when urgent news was to be delivered. It was this bell that sounded, sharp and deliberate, as the scream faded. When the concierge, trembling, reached the penthouse floor in the private lift, with 2 security guards in tow and a nervous assistant manager babbling behind him, they found the body of Mr. Oswald Delacroix, international financier, philanthropist, and recent tabloid obsession, lying crumpled in the corridor. The door to his penthouse suite was ajar. His face was contorted in a grotesque mask of surprise. His gold pocket watch, famous from a dozen public appearances, lay by his outstretched hand, its glass cracked, its chain snapped. But what chilled the blood of everyone present was not the body, nor the broken watch, nor even the faint trickle of blood from his temple. It was the fact that standing silently beside the body, face pale and expressionless, was the bellboy. A young man with sandy hair, in a pressed crimson uniform, his gloved hand still resting on the antique bell. He said nothing as they approached. He simply looked up, blinking slowly, and whispered, "I rang the last hour." 2 hours later, room 203, Hotel Véron, 1 floor below the scene. Hercule Poirot leaned back in the velvet armchair and delicately tapped a speck of lint from his cuff. "Mon ami," he said quietly, "the human mind, how fragile, how chaotic. It races when it should walk. It leaps to conclusions when it should reflect. But the little grey cells," he tapped his temple gently, "they do not panic. They observe. They deduce." Captain Hastings, sitting by the fireplace with a brandy he hadn't yet touched, looked up sharply. "Poirot, you're certain it wasn't suicide?" Poirot gave a small, elegant snort. "Mon Dieu, Hastings, why is it always suicide with the English? A man with everything to lose does not simply fall dead in the corridor of his hotel, and even if he did, why would a bellboy ring a bell afterward and stand like a statue? Well, the boy must be mad. Shell shock, maybe. You saw how he kept repeating himself, 'I rang the last hour,' over and over again." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Exactly," he said. Earlier that day, 11:30 a.m., the arrival of Oswald Delacroix. Mr. Oswald Delacroix arrived in a flurry of silk ties, bodyguards, and scandal. Having made his fortune through offshore investments and then almost lost it in a dramatic court case, he had recently been the focus of both adoration and suspicion. He was due to deliver the keynote address at the Ethics of Wealth Summit, hosted in the hotel's grand ballroom the next morning. A bitter irony, some said. He checked into the penthouse, refused the offer of a private secretary, and instead summoned the bellboy, one Thomas Avery, to handle the arrangement of his trunks. He seemed normal, Avery would later insist, eyes wide and frightened. He didn't say much, asked me to bring up his lunch, then told me he didn't trust anyone in the building. Did he say why? Poirot had asked during their first conversation. Avery had shaken his head. No, only that time was almost up, and he held up his watch and grinned like it was a joke. Now Poirot stood beside the body, which had not yet been removed in accordance with his firm instructions. He knelt, gingerly, so as not to disturb his trousers, and examined the watch. Cracked at 4:17. The time of death, likely. But the chain snapped violently. Violence at close quarters, Poirot murmured. A struggle, yes. But no signs of forced entry, no signs of theft. And why the corridor? Why not inside the suite? He stood and surveyed the scene. There were 5 suites on the penthouse floor, all now sealed. The other guests, a film producer, a retired judge, a travel writer, and the widow of a European ambassador, were being held downstairs for interviews. And the bellboy, isolated in a small room near the staff quarters, guarded but not under arrest. Not yet. Poirot smoothed his mustache and turned to the assistant manager. "Monsieur Perrin," he said, "I will speak with your staff, all of them. Then I wish to see the guests, and I shall need, if you please, a map of this floor and the full log of entries and exits between noon and 4:30 p.m. Perrin gulped. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. Of course." As the manager scurried off, Hastings stepped closer. "You think one of the other guests did it?" Poirot gave a slow smile. "Mon ami, I do not think. I observe, and already something is out of order." "What is it?" Poirot did not answer. Instead, he turned and stared at the antique brass bell at the end of the corridor. It had not been used in decades, and yet today it had sounded the death knell of a man who claimed time was running out. The first thing Poirot did after requesting the floor plan and the guest list was to take a few moments of silent observation. He knew well the importance of allowing the scene to speak for itself before wading into the muddled waters of human motives and alibis. A body had been found, and a bell had rung the last hour. But that was merely the beginning. The key lay not in the corpse, but in the silence that followed. As the other guests remained confined to their rooms, and the bellboy Avery sat motionless, watched by 2 security guards in the hallway, Poirot took the time to examine the immediate vicinity. There was no sign of a struggle beyond the position of the watch, no indication of forced entry into the suite. The door had been ajar, a small detail that suggested no hasty retreat, but rather a deliberate decision to leave the room open after the crime. The fact that Mr. Delacroix had been found outside his suite in the corridor unsettled Poirot. It was too public a space for such a personal, violent act. "Mon ami," Poirot spoke, his voice breaking the quietude that had settled over the scene. "Do you notice anything unusual?" Hastings, ever the soldier, glanced around, but it wasn't his job to notice the subtleties of human behavior. "Everything seems as it should be, Poirot. Well, except for the fact that Delacroix is dead and Avery's acting like he's in shock." Poirot's lips quirked into a smile, but it was one that held no humor. "It is precisely that, acting, which concerns me." Hastings turned back to the bellboy. Avery sat against the wall staring into space. His hands were folded neatly in his lap, but his eyes darted nervously from one person to the next. There was a stillness in him that spoke more of fear than shock, and it was this very stillness that Poirot found troubling. "Let us speak to him now," Poirot suggested. The 2 approached Avery, who barely acknowledged their presence. Poirot, ever the model of courtesy, knelt before him, his eyes narrowing as he studied the young man's face. The bellboy's sandy hair was damp with sweat, his lips dry, his eyes reddened as though from a restless night or perhaps something deeper. "Avery," Poirot said gently, "I understand you are confused, but you must help me, for your own sake. Tell me, why did you ring the bell?" Avery swallowed hard, his throat working with the effort. "I don't know, sir," he whispered. It just seemed the right thing to do. It felt like the end of something." "End of something," Poirot murmured, leaning forward. "Of what, exactly?" The bellboy shook his head. "I don't know, sir. I was just doing my job. Mr. Delacroix asked for me earlier, and I brought him his lunch. He was fine, just fine." Avery's voice trembled slightly. But then, when I returned, he was already lying there. I didn't know what to do." Poirot's gaze softened for a moment, but only a moment. He had learned to read the subtle shifts in a person's posture, the small signs of a lie that would slip through a well-rehearsed story. Avery's hesitation was real, but it was also telling. He wasn't afraid of what had happened to Delacroix, nor was he distressed about his employer's death. He was afraid of something else, something that had yet to surface. "You are sure, Avery," Poirot continued, "that Mr. Delacroix did not speak to you after you entered the suite? That he did not say anything at all before he died?" Avery's eyes flickered, and Poirot's trained eyes caught the movement, a flash of uncertainty. He did say something," Avery stammered. "He said, 'The bell is the last thing. Ring it, and all will be over.'" Poirot straightened, his expression thoughtful. That phrase, "the bell is the last thing," was no ordinary remark. It carried a weight of meaning that was far too deliberate to be a coincidence. Mr. Delacroix had been aware of his fate, or at least had foreseen it in some cryptic manner. But why the bell? What significance did the ringing of an old brass bell hold? Before Poirot could continue, there was a soft knock at the door, followed by the assistant manager, Monsieur Perrin, entering with the floor plan and the guest list. "The list of guests, as you requested, Monsieur Poirot," Perrin said, laying the papers on the table, "and the map of the penthouse floor." Poirot skimmed the list. There were only 4 other guests on the floor besides Delacroix, a quiet group of people who seemed to have little in common at first glance. The retired judge, Sir Raymond Duval, had a reputation for his stern demeanor, but was known to enjoy the finer things in life. The travel writer, Miss Claire Montgomery, was a young woman with a penchant for adventure and a few scandalous rumors following her wherever she went. Then there was the film producer, Pierre de Lavigne, a man whose charm and connections masked a streak of ruthless ambition. And lastly, the widow of the European ambassador, Lady Livia Harrow, a woman whose beauty and composure hid a mind as sharp as a knife. Poirot's eyes flicked over their names, noting the incongruity of their presence in such a setting. Why were they here? What had brought them together at this moment? He would find the answer soon, but first he needed to speak with each of them to understand what lay behind their carefully crafted facades. "Please have the guests brought to the lobby," Poirot instructed Perrin. "I will speak with them one at a time." The first to be brought in was Miss Claire Montgomery, the travel writer. She entered with a smile that seemed too practiced, too perfect for the gravity of the situation. Her eyes darted nervously toward the body in the corridor before she regained her composure, offering a curtsy to Poirot. "Monsieur Poirot, I do hope you don't think me involved in this tragedy," she said, her voice a mixture of concern and faint irritation. "I was simply minding my own business, reading in my room. I heard the bell, of course, but I thought it was just the staff." Poirot's gaze lingered on her, the soft glow of the chandelier reflecting in his dark eyes. "Ah, the bell," he said softly. "A sound that is difficult to ignore. But tell me, mademoiselle, when you heard it, did you also hear the scream?" Her lips twitched, and for a moment Poirot saw the tiniest hint of something unnatural. Guilt, perhaps. She hesitated, and in that hesitation Poirot's mind raced. "No," she said quickly, "I didn't hear a scream. But you did hear the bell." She nodded. "Yes, but as I said, I thought nothing of it." Poirot smiled thinly, and in that smile was the promise of an answer that would come only when all the pieces were aligned. The game was afoot, and the little grey cells were already working overtime. Poirot nodded slowly as Miss Claire Montgomery spoke, his gaze steady, his fingers steepled before his lips in that characteristic manner that suggested deep contemplation. The young woman's story was neat, almost too neat. It lacked the necessary weight of uncertainty that might accompany such a sudden and violent crime. Her quick denial of hearing the scream, when clearly it had been heard by others on the floor, seemed odd to him. "Miss Montgomery," Poirot said, his voice calm, "you say you did not hear the scream, but you did hear the bell." Her eyes widened just slightly at the question, the hint of a flush creeping up her neck. I suppose I didn't make the connection at first," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "It's all so overwhelming. I'm not used to being part of such a horrible thing." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "That is understandable, but I would like to know more about your actions immediately following the sound of the bell. You did not find it strange that, of all bells in the hotel, this particular one, used so rarely, rang at such a peculiar moment?" She stopped herself, biting her lip. "I didn't think much about it. I was too startled by the noise to consider its significance. I thought it was a call for someone. I thought I was mistaken." Poirot did not immediately respond. He studied her with great precision, watching her carefully controlled expression, noting the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched her handbag a little too tightly. It was a reaction not unlike one he had witnessed before, when a person was trying to mask something deeper. He made a mental note to revisit this interview after speaking with the others. As he dismissed Miss Montgomery from the room, he turned his attention to the next guest on his list, Sir Raymond Duval, the retired judge. The elderly man was known for his impeccable reputation, but as Poirot had learned over the years, a reputation was often the very thing that concealed darker secrets. Sir Raymond entered with the measured step of someone accustomed to authority, his silver hair immaculately combed, his attire crisp and dignified. But it was his eyes that caught Poirot's attention, eyes that held a certain coldness, as if they had seen too many cases where justice had not been served. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," Sir Raymond greeted him with a slight bow, his voice carrying a faint rasp. "I trust the investigation is progressing well?" Poirot did not offer pleasantries. He knew better than to engage in empty niceties when the matter at hand was so pressing. "I'm afraid, Sir Raymond, that it will progress only when all the facts are laid bare, and I trust you will help me in this." The retired judge gave a small, wry smile. "Of course, you have my full cooperation. I must admit I'd hoped to avoid this sort of complication during my stay here, but it seems fortune has other plans." "I understand," Poirot said, his tone casual but calculating. "Tell me, Sir Raymond, did you hear the scream?" Sir Raymond raised an eyebrow at the question, his lips pressing together as though considering his response. "No," he said finally after a long pause. "I did not hear any scream. But then I was in my room. I had just finished reading the morning papers when I decided to take a nap. The bell, however, did ring. I thought it strange. I assumed it was part of the hotel's usual service, though I did not think much of it." "And yet," Poirot pressed, "you did not hear the scream?" Sir Raymond shifted uncomfortably, though his expression remained composed. "I already told you, Monsieur Poirot, I did not hear it." Poirot studied him carefully. He had expected this answer. It was too rehearsed. There was something beneath the surface of the retired judge's calm demeanor, a subtle tension in the set of his shoulders, a slight tightening of his jaw as he spoke. "Very well, Sir Raymond," Poirot said, nodding slowly. "Thank you for your time." The retired judge's posture straightened as he turned to leave. "If there is anything further you need from me," Sir Raymond said, his voice courteous but clipped, "you need only ask." Poirot did not watch him go immediately. He was busy turning over the exchange in his mind. Sir Raymond had not heard the scream, but it seemed highly improbable that a man of his age and experience could sleep through such a noise, especially in a hotel of this size where the walls and floors were not particularly soundproof. Poirot was beginning to wonder if the scream was as important as the bell. Was it simply the sound of an impending death, or was it a signal of something more? His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of the next guest, Pierre de Lavigne, the film producer. The man was everything Poirot expected. Dapper, charming, and just a touch insincere. He entered the room with a flourish, offering Poirot a handshake that was firm but far too rehearsed. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," de Lavigne said in his thick French accent. "What an unfortunate set of circumstances we have here. You must forgive me if I am not as surprised as I ought to be. My life is full of dramatic twists and turns, after all." Poirot merely raised an eyebrow. "Is it, Monsieur de Lavigne? And yet you are calm, despite the terrible event that has occurred." De Lavigne laughed lightly, his eyes twinkling with an almost theatrical gleam. "What can one do? We are all here for a reason, no? But of course, you want to know if I heard the scream. I did not, Monsieur Poirot. I was in my room making arrangements for my next picture. The bell rang, yes, but I did not think anything of it. I assumed it was merely part of the hotel's usual routine." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his expression unreadable. "I see. And did you know Mr. Delacroix well?" De Lavigne's smile faltered ever so slightly, but just for a moment. "We were acquainted, of course. He was in the business of money, I in the business of art. But we were not close friends." The producer's eyes flickered briefly, but Poirot could not determine whether the shift was due to genuine discomfort or something more calculated. "You didn't think his sudden passing unusual? A man who had so many enemies, and yet you found it unremarkable that he would die under such mysterious circumstances?" De Lavigne's gaze sharpened. "I did not say it was unremarkable. I simply have learned not to waste time speculating. If there is an answer, Monsieur Poirot, you will find it." Poirot gave a small, polite nod. "Indeed I will." After de Lavigne left, Poirot's mind raced. The film producer's reaction had been too smooth, too practiced. It was as if he were playing a part, and Poirot was the only one who saw through the performance. But why? Why all the games, the subtleties, the cryptic responses? And then there was Lady Livia Harrow, the last to be questioned. She entered with a grace that seemed to fill the room, her eyes hidden behind a pair of dark sunglasses that only made her appear more mysterious. Her beauty was striking, but it was her poise that caught Poirot's attention. She exuded confidence, but not in the usual way. It was the confidence of someone who knew exactly what others saw in her and used it to her advantage. "I'm afraid this is all very tiresome, Monsieur Poirot," Lady Livia said with a sigh as she took a seat, removing her sunglasses. "A tragedy, of course, but I hardly see how my involvement is necessary." Poirot studied her carefully, taking note of the way her fingers traced the edge of her handbag, her lips pressed tightly together. "One might think, Lady Harrow, that in a situation such as this, the involvement of every guest is indeed necessary." She smiled, a slow and deliberate curve of her lips. "Very well, if you insist, but I assure you, I know nothing about the man's death. I was in my room, alone. I didn't hear a thing." And yet, as Poirot looked into her eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she was letting on. Her calm demeanor was the mask of a woman who had been through far worse. The pieces were coming together, but Poirot knew the real truth would be found only when he could connect them. The bell, the scream, the behavior of the guests, each detail pointed in a different direction, but all led toward one singular conclusion. It was time to bring them all together. Poirot sat in his chair, his fingers pressed together in deep concentration. The threads of the mystery were delicate, and yet he could already sense the subtle pattern forming. Each piece of the puzzle seemed at first glance disjointed, yet there was a connection, an invisible thread running through it all. The bell, the scream, the odd behavior of the guests. There was more to this crime than met the eye, and Poirot was determined to unravel it. He allowed the conversation with Lady Livia Harrow to linger in his thoughts, her calmness more a shield than a mere display of poise. Her reaction, or lack thereof, was the most telling. Unlike the others, she did not seem startled by the tragic events. She had not even seemed particularly distressed when the body had been discovered. Lady Harrow's indifference was as much a clue as anything the others had said or done, but it was the bell that held his attention now. It had been a peculiar detail. So rarely used, the bell had been a key element in this crime, a simple device, yet one that had set the stage for a murder most foul. The ringing of that bell was the signal, the prelude to the fatal act, and yet none of the suspects had shown much curiosity about the bell's significance. Poirot's train of thought was interrupted as his assistant, Georges, entered the room. The young man's face was pale, his brow furrowed with concern. "Monsieur Poirot," Georges said, his voice tinged with urgency. "There has been a development, a new clue, you might say. It's from the hotel staff." Poirot raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Now we are getting to the heart of things, I think. Lead the way, Georges." The two men made their way down the dimly lit hallway toward the staff quarters. The hotel, as grand as it appeared, was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and service rooms, designed for function rather than elegance. The staff, mostly young and quiet, went about their duties with minimal interruption, but it was in the quiet corners that Poirot knew the most valuable information often lay. Georges led Poirot to the small office of the hotel's head bellboy, a young man named Albert Duval. Albert was visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he handed over a small folded piece of paper. "Please, Monsieur Poirot, this was found near the bell tower," Albert explained, his voice low. "It was tucked inside the bell mechanism. I don't know what it means, but it was there." Poirot carefully unfolded the paper. On it was a cryptic message, written in hurried scrawl. "The bell rings thrice, but the third will never be heard. Only silence follows." The words sent a chill down Poirot's spine, though his expression remained impassive. He looked at Albert for an explanation, but the young man could offer none. "It's strange," Albert added. "I don't know who wrote it, but I found it near the bell, as if someone had slipped it in just before—" Poirot held up his hand to stop the bellboy. "I understand, Albert. You did well to bring this to me." He paused, his mind working swiftly, connecting the dots. The message was clear, though its meaning remained elusive. The bell had been rung 3 times, and the third ring had gone unheard. This was not merely a signal. It was a forewarning. The bell, the message, the bellboy's discovery. All of it pointed to something more than an accidental death. "You may go, Albert, but I would advise you to be cautious. Keep your eyes open. There are those in this hotel who may not have your best interests at heart." Albert nodded, his face pale, before he hurried away, leaving Poirot alone with the cryptic note. Poirot's mind was already racing through the possibilities, each one more complex than the last. The third ring, the silence that followed. He knew what it meant. The murderer had been in the know, had orchestrated everything with chilling precision. The bell had been the signal to the murderer, a mark of the beginning of the end. Poirot's attention shifted, and without a moment's hesitation, he made his way to the hotel's grand drawing room, where the suspects were gathered. It was time to confront them, to put the final pieces into place. But as he entered the room, a thought struck him. The bell, the message, the suspects. What did they all have in common? It wasn't just the location, nor the timing of the murder, nor the bell itself. No, there was something more subtle at play here. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the group. Miss Montgomery, Sir Raymond, Monsieur de Lavigne, and Lady Harrow. They were all present, but there was a tension in the air, palpable, almost suffocating. The way they watched each other, as if they knew more than they were letting on, was unmistakable. Poirot took his usual seat, his posture impeccable, his mind sharp. "You are all here because I believe one of you has committed a terrible crime," he began, his voice cool and methodical. "A crime that I will uncover by the use of my little grey cells." The group stiffened, their eyes darting from one to the other. It was clear that each of them had already formed their own conclusions about who the guilty party might be, but Poirot's calmness only seemed to unsettle them more. "Before I proceed," Poirot continued, "let me ask you all a question. A simple one. Tell me, what do you know of the bell that was used to signal the murder?" A silence descended upon the group. Sir Raymond cleared his throat, his eyes wary. "The bell? I'm not sure I understand what you mean. It's a hotel bell, surely. It's hardly unusual for it to ring." "Ah, but you are mistaken, Sir Raymond," Poirot said with a soft smile. "This bell is not used for ordinary calls. It is only rung in the most unusual of circumstances. A signal, if you will, to those who know how to listen." Miss Montgomery shifted nervously in her seat, her fingers tightly gripping the edge of her chair. I don't know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot. I've heard the bell, but I never thought anything of it." Poirot's eyes flicked to her, noting the flush creeping up her neck. "But you did hear it, did you not? You heard it just before the murder. You even mentioned it in your statement." Miss Montgomery paled, her lips pressing into a thin line. She looked down at her hands, unwilling to meet his gaze. "Yes, but it was nothing. Just a coincidence, I'm sure." Poirot's gaze moved on to Monsieur de Lavigne, who sat lounging in his chair, clearly unruffled by the conversation. "And you, Monsieur de Lavigne, did you hear the bell?" The film producer's eyes twinkled with that same elusive gleam. "I told you, Monsieur Poirot, I did not hear it, but I also told you I do not believe in coincidences. Surely you do not either." Poirot allowed a brief smile to touch his lips, though it did not reach his eyes. "Indeed, Monsieur de Lavigne, I do not believe in coincidences." Finally, Poirot turned his attention to Lady Harrow, whose gaze never wavered. Her lips were curved into a slight, enigmatic smile, but her eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, betrayed her. "Lady Harrow," Poirot said quietly, "I believe you know more about this bell than you let on." For the first time since entering the room, Lady Harrow's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Enough for Poirot to know that he was closing in on the truth. "Perhaps you are right, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Perhaps I do know more than I've said." The game was on. Poirot leaned forward, the gleam in his eye as sharp as a needle drawing thread through silk. Lady Harrow's admission, slight as it was, opened a door, one he had been gently knocking on since the morning. A confession cloaked in ambiguity was still a confession, yet it was not enough. "Not yet." "Then, madame," he said softly, "you will be so good as to enlighten us." Lady Harrow tilted her head, elegant as ever. Her expression remained carefully composed, but her fingers, so poised moments earlier, twitched almost imperceptibly in her lap. Poirot noticed, of course. "I do not claim to have heard the bell that night," she began, "but I do know it has not rung in years. Not properly. The tower is purely decorative now. It's quite old, rusted. I remember the manager telling me during renovations that it was no longer connected to the main system. The bell, it shouldn't be able to ring." There was a stir among the others. Sir Raymond raised his eyebrows. Monsieur de Lavigne leaned forward, lips parting with interest. Miss Montgomery's eyes darted from Lady Harrow to Poirot, clearly rattled. Poirot gave a slight nod. "Indeed, it should not ring, and yet it did." The room lapsed into silence. The ticking of a wall clock punctuated the tension like a metronome. Poirot let the silence stretch, watching each face, waiting for the smallest betrayal, a glance too long, a breath too quick. Then he rose, adjusting the cuffs of his suit with methodical precision. "You must forgive me," he said, brushing a speck of lint from his lapel. "There is something I must confirm. If you will all remain here." He did not wait for agreement. With Georges quietly falling in step behind him, Poirot made his way through the corridor once more. This time, his destination was not the bell tower, nor the drawing room, but the manager's office. He had questions that required the precise answers only the management's records could provide. The manager, a balding, fastidious man named Mr. Calloway, was waiting behind his desk, shuffling papers when Poirot entered. He sprang to his feet. "Monsieur Poirot, I wasn't expecting—" Poirot held up a hand. "You are aware, of course, that the bell rang last night, the bell in the tower." Mr. Calloway's brows lifted in surprise. "The tower bell, but that's impossible. It's been disconnected since the renovation in 1936. We left it in place for architectural charm, nothing more. And yet it rang." Calloway blinked rapidly. "Then someone must have—" He stopped himself. "Go on, monsieur," Poirot encouraged. "Well, someone must have accessed it directly. There's a small pull rope behind a maintenance panel on the upper floor, a sort of manual override. It was meant for testing, but I had assumed, well, no one uses it." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Where is this panel?" "Just beside the stairwell, behind the service cupboard." Without another word, Poirot turned and walked swiftly from the room. Georges followed, increasingly uneasy. They located the panel in question easily enough. It was dusty, but showed signs of recent disturbance, the edges of the paint scratched, a fine smear of oil along the latch. Poirot examined it carefully, opening it to reveal the old-fashioned pull rope, its end frayed but intact. Poirot touched it lightly, then looked at the floor. There were faint scuff marks in the dust. Shoe prints, perhaps, small ones. He nodded to himself. "Georges," he murmured, "who among our guests might wear a size 4 shoe?" Georges paused. "Size 4, monsieur? That's quite small. Perhaps Miss Montgomery?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Just so." With newfound purpose, Poirot returned to the drawing room, pausing just outside the door to collect himself. Then he stepped inside. "Mes amis," he announced with quiet authority, "I've made a small discovery." All eyes turned toward him. He did not sit this time, but walked slowly into the room, his hands behind his back. The bell that rang last night was not, as we were told, operated by the usual system. No, it was rung manually, using a hidden mechanism behind a panel in the servants' stairwell. And someone took the trouble to use it, not just as a lark, not as a joke, but as part of a plan. Miss Montgomery paled. Poirot saw it, just as he saw the flicker of tension in her jaw. "Let us consider, then," Poirot continued, "what purpose this bell would serve. Why ring it at that precise hour? Who would be poised to act or react upon hearing it?" No one spoke. Poirot took a slow step closer to Miss Montgomery. A signal, that is what it was. A signal to someone who knew its meaning. A call to action, if you like. He studied her face with serene intensity. "I believe, mademoiselle, that it was you who rang the bell." Her breath caught. "What? That's absurd. Why would I—" "Because," said Poirot, his voice velvet but sharp, "you were being manipulated. You were told that ringing the bell at precisely 11:45 would summon help. You believed it. But in truth, the bell's sound merely served to mask another noise, the sound of the fatal blow dealt to Mr. Lazenby." There was a gasp from Sir Raymond. Monsieur de Lavigne narrowed his eyes. Poirot turned, now pacing as he elaborated. "Imagine the mind that conceived this. Ingenious. The bell, once a piece of forgotten ornamentation, is given a sinister purpose. A scapegoat is chosen, one who would never question the order, one who could be convinced she was doing good. Someone young, impressionable, loyal to those she trusts." Miss Montgomery looked stricken. "Who told you to ring it?" Poirot asked gently. She shook her head, lips trembling. I don't know what you mean. No one told me." Poirot held up the slip of paper recovered earlier, the cryptic message. "This was found near the bell, a warning, or perhaps a confession. The bell rings thrice, but the third will never be heard. Mademoiselle, it is time for the truth. Miss Montgomery buried her face in her hands. I didn't know what it meant, she whispered. I only did what he asked. Poirot stepped closer. Who, mademoiselle? She looked up, tears brimming, her voice barely carried across the room. Monsieur de Lavigne. A slow, breathless silence followed. The Frenchman sat back, his expression unreadable. So now I'm to be the villain of the piece? Poirot gave a small bow. Not yet. Not conclusively. But you are perhaps a composer of scenes, a producer of drama. And what is a murder, after all, but a scene with the highest stakes? De Lavigne laughed softly, too softly. You flatter me, monsieur. But Miss Montgomery has a vivid imagination, does she not? Poirot's eyes twinkled. We shall see. He turned to the others. The question remains. If she rang the bell and believed she was aiding someone in need, who gave her that impression? Who stood to benefit from her belief? His gaze landed last on Lady Harrow. Once again, her smile did not reach her eyes. Lady Harrow's smile tightened, her hands curling delicately around the porcelain teacup before her. It was an action that seemed too deliberate, too measured, as though she was calculating the next words to leave her lips with surgical precision. The faintest flicker of something, was it guilt, crossed her features before she regained control, her composure seemingly unshaken. Mr. Poirot, she began, her voice smooth, your deductions are intriguing, but you are quite mistaken if you believe I had anything to do with the bell. I would never involve myself in such petty schemes. Poirot did not respond immediately. He merely stared at her, his gaze unyielding, as though he were peeling away the layers of her facade, one by one. He had always admired how easily people believed in the illusion of power she exuded, her calculated beauty, her poised confidence. But now, with every word that left her mouth, he could see the cracks. I'm not so sure, Lady Harrow, Poirot replied, his voice soft but firm. You see, it is not the bell that interests me, but the motive behind it. Why would Miss Montgomery, so vulnerable and impressionable, be given a task to which she had no understanding of the consequence? Lady Harrow's fingers tightened around her teacup, her knuckles whitening ever so slightly. I hardly see how my actions could be relevant, she said with a haughty tilt of her head. Poirot's lips quirked upward in a small smile. That, madame, is where you are mistaken. You see, the very essence of this case lies in the motive, and as with any crime, there must be a motive to drive a person to act. In this case, the motive is hidden beneath layers of deceit, and it is one that cannot simply be ignored. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but only for a brief moment. She was too skilled at hiding her emotions. And what exactly do you believe that motive to be? She asked, her voice lowering. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. You knew, didn't you, Lady Harrow? You knew that the bell would play a crucial role in Lazenby's death. You arranged for it to ring precisely when it did, masking the sound of the fatal blow. It was no coincidence, no mere accident. There was a pause, the room thick with tension. The other guests watched in silence, their eyes darting between Poirot and Lady Harrow. Even Sir Raymond, who had been the most vocal in dismissing Poirot's conclusions, now appeared somewhat unsettled. Lady Harrow inhaled sharply, but her voice remained steady. You're quite mistaken, Monsieur Poirot. I had nothing to do with this bell, nor with Mr. Lazenby's unfortunate demise. Poirot's expression softened slightly, his tone becoming almost paternal. Ah, but you see, madame, this is where you have underestimated the power of psychology. The human mind is a labyrinth, and it is within this labyrinth that we find our motivations, our desires, our fears. You have been playing a game, one that you thought you could control. But now the rules have changed. Lady Harrow's eyes darkened for a brief moment, and for the first time, Poirot saw a crack in her demeanor. He had struck a nerve. The rules have changed, she echoed, a trace of mockery in her voice. Yes, madame, Poirot said, standing tall. And you, like everyone else in this room, are now caught in the consequences of your own actions. You thought you could manipulate the situation, but there is one thing you overlooked. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. The silence was palpable as everyone waited for him to continue. You overlooked one very important detail, Poirot said, his voice lowering with intensity. The bell itself. It has a history, one that you are intimately familiar with. Lady Harrow stiffened, her eyes flickering toward the other guests. Sir Raymond raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, while Miss Montgomery's gaze darted between Poirot and Lady Harrow. Monsieur de Lavigne, still composed, seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere and took a small step back. Poirot continued. You see, the bell is not merely a relic of the past, as the hotel manager would have us believe. It was once a significant part of this establishment's history, a symbol of power, of control. And it is this history that you have cleverly exploited, Lady Harrow. She did not respond immediately, but Poirot saw her fingers tremble slightly as she clasped them together in her lap, the faintest sign of discomfort. The bell rings thrice, but the third will never be heard, Poirot repeated, his voice a whisper now, as though he were drawing the curtain back on a long-hidden truth. You knew that ringing the bell at precisely that time would direct attention away from the true cause of death. You knew it would distract everyone from the reality of what happened in that room. Lady Harrow's lips parted, but no words came out. For a moment she seemed almost as though she were lost for words, the veneer of control slipping away. Poirot did not press further, instead stepping back and crossing his arms, his gaze never leaving her face. The bell, he continued, was not merely a signal for Miss Montgomery. It was a signal for you. It was a means to an end, a method to conceal the truth and create a diversion. There was a heavy pause, the room quiet except for the ticking of the clock. And then, in a voice almost too quiet to hear, Lady Harrow spoke. I did not kill him, she said, her voice trembling just slightly. I never wanted to. I never meant for any of this to happen. Poirot's expression softened, just for a moment. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the guilt and the regret, but it was too late. The web she had woven had already been unraveled. Then why, Poirot asked softly, did you allow it to happen? Why play the game if you were not prepared for the consequences? Lady Harrow's shoulders sagged, the weight of her actions settling in. Because I had no choice, she whispered. It was the only way to ensure that my secrets would remain safe. Poirot's gaze never wavered. Secrets, madame? What secrets? For the first time, Lady Harrow's composure seemed to falter completely. She stared at the floor, her lips quivering as if the words she had held back for so long were now struggling to escape. It wasn't about Lazenby, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was about something much bigger, something I've spent my entire life hiding. I couldn't let him expose me. Poirot felt the faintest stirring of unease within him. He could sense that the mystery was far from over. There was still a deeper layer waiting to be uncovered. As the others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, Poirot's mind raced. He had the pieces, but the picture they formed was still incomplete. Lady Harrow, he said, his tone calm but insistent. You will tell me what you know, all of it, or I will have no choice but to expose you for what you truly are. Her head shot up, and for the first time since he had entered the room, Poirot saw the true depth of her fear. She was cornered now, and there was nowhere left to hide. Slowly, she nodded. Lady Harrow's eyes flickered toward the door, as though searching for an escape, but the door remained shut. The room felt smaller, more oppressive now, the weight of her secret pressing down on her like a physical force. Poirot watched her, his gaze never leaving her face. She was trapped in her own web of deception, and it was only a matter of time before she was forced to confront the truth. She inhaled deeply, her chest rising and falling with an almost audible tremor. Poirot remained silent, allowing the pause to stretch out, giving her space to speak, but also ensuring the silence hung in the air long enough to unsettle her further. I never meant for anyone to be hurt," Lady Harrow whispered, her voice quivering. "I thought I could control it. I thought I could keep things in line, that it wouldn't get out of hand." Poirot stepped closer, his sharp eyes noting every movement, every subtle shift in her demeanor. "Control. You thought you could control the situation, but instead, it controlled you. It led you to a crime, one you never truly intended, but one you allowed to happen, nonetheless." Her eyes snapped to him, a flicker of defiance mingled with the fear. "You don't understand, Poirot. It was never supposed to go this far. I had no choice." She paused, as if gathering her thoughts. "The man I was trying to protect, he would have been destroyed. He would have lost everything." Poirot tilted his head, his gaze never leaving hers. Who? Who were you protecting, Lady Harrow?" Her lips pressed together, and she seemed to hesitate for a long moment. Poirot's intuition told him that she had already come too far to back out now, that the truth would soon spill from her. But it would come on her terms, slowly, painfully. Finally, her voice, barely above a whisper, broke the silence. "It was Robert Montgomery." The name hung in the air like a forgotten melody, and Poirot's mind began to piece together the implications. Robert Montgomery, Miss Montgomery's father, a man whose reputation had been slowly crumbling over the past few years, a man whose debts had accumulated to unspeakable levels. Poirot had heard whispers of his financial troubles, though nothing concrete had ever surfaced. But now, Lady Harrow's confession was shedding light on an entirely new aspect of the case. "Robert Montgomery," Poirot repeated softly, testing the name on his tongue. "You were protecting him." She nodded slowly, her hands trembling in her lap. Yes, Robert had made enemies, serious ones, the kind of enemies who would stop at nothing to destroy him. Financial ruin was only the beginning. He had been involved in unsavory dealings, Poirot. I could not allow him to fall any further. Poirot remained still, absorbing the weight of her words. He could see the fear in her eyes, the terror of someone who had gambled everything on a man's survival, only to realize that the consequences of her actions were spiraling out of control. "And Lazenby?" Poirot asked. "Where does he fit into this?" Lady Harrow's lips tightened, and for a moment she said nothing. Poirot did not rush her. He knew that the truth would come out in its own time, but the pieces were beginning to fall into place. "Lazenby had discovered something," she said at last, her voice quiet. "He had stumbled onto Robert's involvement in some shady transactions. He was going to expose it. I couldn't allow that to happen. Not after everything Robert had done for me." Poirot's mind raced, the details clicking together with alarming speed. Lazenby's death had been more than just a crime. It had been the result of a desperate attempt to cover up something far more dangerous. But the question remained, how had the bell played such a pivotal role? "The bell," Poirot said, almost to himself. "You knew that ringing it at precisely that moment would drown out the sound of the fatal blow, didn't you?" Lady Harrow winced, as though struck by the accuracy of his words. "Yes. I had to make it look like an accident, something no one could explain. The bell was my cover." She was speaking freely now, as though the weight of her guilt was finally too much to bear. Poirot could see that she had reached the point where the truth was no longer something she could withhold. "I had a plan," she continued, her voice hollow. "I thought that if I made everything look like a simple accident, no one would ever question it. The bell would be the perfect diversion, the one thing that would mask everything else." Poirot nodded slowly, understanding now why she had become so fixated on the bell. It had been her alibi, her escape route, a carefully orchestrated detail in a larger scheme to protect Montgomery. But it hadn't gone as planned. "Why, Lady Harrow?" Poirot asked softly. "Why go so far? Was it truly just to protect Robert Montgomery?" Her gaze dropped to the floor, her hands twisting in her lap. "I owed him everything, everything. He saved me from ruin, from scandal, and I promised him that I would protect him no matter the cost." Poirot's expression softened just slightly, but his mind was already working through the next steps. The puzzle pieces were falling into place with alarming speed, but one crucial element remained elusive. How had Robert Montgomery's involvement gone so far, without anyone else noticing? And how did Miss Montgomery fit into the web of deceit her mother had woven? "Miss Montgomery," Poirot murmured, almost to himself. "She knew, didn't she?" Lady Harrow's head shot up, her eyes widening. No, she couldn't have known. I never wanted her involved." But Poirot had already seen the signs, the way Miss Montgomery had reacted to the bell's chime, the way she had recoiled when Poirot had mentioned her father's name. The young woman might have been innocent of the crime, but she was not immune to its reach. Lady Harrow's attempt to shield her from the truth had likely only created more questions. "The truth always finds its way to the surface, Madame," Poirot said, his voice firm. "Whether we like it or not." He turned, his eyes scanning the room. The others had been silent throughout the exchange, each of them waiting for the next move, but Poirot knew that the time for waiting was over. "Now, we must speak to Miss Montgomery," Poirot said, his voice brokering no argument. "The final piece of the puzzle lies with her." Lady Harrow's face turned pale at the mention of her daughter, and Poirot could see the conflict brewing behind her eyes. Yet she said nothing, as though resigned to the inevitability of the truth coming to light. Poirot straightened his coat, his mind already racing ahead. The game was far from over, but the pieces were finally aligning. He had no time to waste. "We must act swiftly," Poirot said, his tone final. "The clock is ticking, and the truth cannot wait any longer." Lady Harrow's face had gone pale, but her expression hardened as Poirot turned to face the others in the room. They were all watching him now, their eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion, fear, and anticipation. Each one of them had been playing their part, and now the game was nearing its end. But it was not over yet. There were still too many pieces left to be placed before the final revelation. Poirot's gaze swept over them, lingering on Miss Montgomery. She had been quiet, her hands clenched tightly in her lap as she watched her mother. Her eyes flickered nervously toward Poirot, and though she tried to hide it, the tension in her posture was unmistakable. The young woman knew more than she had let on. Poirot was sure of it. He had seen the subtle signs, the quick glances, the tightness around her jaw. But how much did she truly know? He could not allow himself to be distracted. The truth was still far from fully uncovered. There was no time to waste. He turned to Lady Harrow, his expression unreadable. "Madame, you must understand that this game is not over. We have only just begun." Lady Harrow nodded, though her expression was tight with anxiety. "I didn't want any of this to happen. I never wanted it to go this far." "Indeed," Poirot said, his tone sharp. "But now it has, and there is still much you are withholding from me. I will not stop until the full truth is laid bare." She swallowed hard, but the look of guilt on her face was undeniable. "What do you mean? I've told you everything I can." Poirot raised an eyebrow, considering her words carefully. He had no doubt that Lady Harrow had confessed to much, but her reluctance to speak the complete truth was apparent. And there was one question still gnawing at the back of his mind, the question of Robert Montgomery's involvement. Why had he never been questioned directly? Why had the investigation been so focused on Lazenby's death, when the true threat lay much deeper? "Madame, there is one final piece of the puzzle," Poirot said quietly, his eyes never leaving Lady Harrow's face. "You have told me of your actions, your reasons for protecting Robert Montgomery, but you have not told me why he is still free. Why has he not been arrested for his role in these events? Lady Harrow's eyes widened, and she glanced quickly at Miss Montgomery, who had gone completely still. Poirot noted the exchange, the brief flash of understanding between the two women. It was subtle, but telling. I couldn't, Lady Harrow whispered, her voice breaking. Robert would never have survived the scandal. I couldn't bring myself to do it. He was already in so much trouble, and his debts, the mess he was in. She trailed off, her face turning away from Poirot. I couldn't ruin him completely. Poirot's gaze narrowed. The truth was beginning to piece itself together, but something still didn't sit right. There was a hidden truth here, one buried beneath layers of shame, guilt, and fear. Robert Montgomery had been the orchestrator, the one who had placed them all in this impossible position. But why had Lady Harrow allowed it to continue? Poirot turned slowly, his eyes now fixing on Miss Montgomery. The girl had remained silent. Throughout the conversation, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were wide, betraying the turmoil she must have been feeling. But there was something else. Something hidden in the way she fidgeted with the ring on her finger, the way her gaze darted to her mother before quickly averting. "Miss Montgomery," Poirot began, his voice measured but insistent, "I must ask you one thing. What do you know about your father's dealings? What role did you play in this tragedy?" The room fell silent. Lady Harrow's gaze snapped to her daughter, her face etched with a combination of fear and confusion. Miss Montgomery froze, her expression faltering for just a moment. Poirot could see the flicker of panic behind her eyes. I don't know what you're talking about," Miss Montgomery said quickly, her voice trembling. "My father. I had nothing to do with any of this." Poirot studied her closely, his gaze sharp. He had no intention of letting her off so easily. Her reaction was too quick, too defensive. There was something she was hiding, something she feared to reveal. "Ah, but you do know, Miss Montgomery," Poirot said, his tone unwavering. "You were in that room, weren't you? You were there when Lazenby was murdered. When the bell rang, you heard the sound, just like everyone else." Miss Montgomery's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, her hand reached for her throat as though she were trying to steady herself. Poirot watched her closely, his mind calculating the odds, the twists and turns of the story. "You see?" Poirot continued, his voice soft yet insistent. "It is not the bell that tells the truth. It is the people who ring it, who hear it, who react to it. You, Miss Montgomery, heard it. But you also reacted in a way that no one else did. You flinched, just for a moment. The bell was your signal. You knew exactly what it meant." Lady Harrow looked between Poirot and her daughter, confusion slowly turning into understanding. Her gaze fell to the floor as though in defeat. "Poirot," Lady Harrow began, her voice low. "No, I couldn't." "Ah, but you must," Poirot interrupted gently. "The truth is never as simple as we wish it to be. It is like a complicated puzzle. Each piece fits, but only when we are willing to face it, to confront the reality we have long denied." The silence in the room was suffocating now, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Poirot felt the pieces of the puzzle coming together at last. It wasn't just the bell that had marked the moment of death. It was the knowledge of its chime, the understanding of its purpose, that had made Miss Montgomery's reaction so telling. She had known the truth all along. But why? "Miss Montgomery," Poirot said, his voice softening but still firm, "it is time to speak. Time to tell me what you know. Why did you help your mother hide the truth? Why did you protect Robert Montgomery from his fate?" She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. Slowly, as though the weight of her actions were finally becoming too much to bear, she spoke. "I didn't want to lose her," she whispered. "I didn't want to lose my mother. She would have done anything for him, for Robert, and I I wanted to protect her, even if it meant covering up the truth. The pieces clicked into place. Miss Montgomery had been complicit, not out of malice, but out of desperation, a desperate desire to keep her mother from unraveling. But Poirot knew that the truth would not stay hidden forever. The game had finally reached its conclusion. Poirot's expression remained calm, his eyes never leaving Miss Montgomery's face as she spoke. He had known that this moment would come, that the pressure of the investigation would slowly unravel the carefully constructed web of lies. Yet even now, as the truth began to surface, Poirot could not help but feel a sense of pity for the young woman. She was not the true architect of this crime, but she was certainly a part of it, a victim of the circumstances just as much as her mother. But pity was not what Poirot needed now. The solution was near, but there was one final step to take, one last piece of the puzzle to turn over. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging Miss Montgomery's confession. "Ah, Miss Montgomery, you have done well to speak," Poirot said gently. "But there is still more to be said, n'est-ce pas? You say you did this to protect your mother, but you must also ask yourself, what has your silence truly cost?" Her eyes darted between her mother and Poirot, her hands trembling in her lap. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I never wanted anyone to be hurt." "But people have been hurt, madame," Poirot said, his tone gentle but insistent. "And now it is time for the full truth to come to light." He turned to Lady Harrow, whose face was drawn with exhaustion and guilt. "You see, Lady Harrow, it is not simply the lies we tell that burden us. It is the lies we choose to let others live with. Your daughter has made her choice to speak, but now you must face your own." Lady Harrow swallowed hard, but there was no more defiance in her eyes, only resignation. "I did it to protect him," she said quietly. "To protect Robert. I knew that if we went public with the truth, everything would fall apart. The scandal would ruin him, and I couldn't bear that. He was the only thing that mattered to me." Poirot studied her for a moment, noting the fragility in her voice, the way her hands shook as she clasped them together. It was clear that Lady Harrow had been driven by love for Robert Montgomery, and perhaps even more so, love for the idea of a life free from the consequences of their actions. She had made a fatal error. Of course, but her motives were not entirely selfish. "And yet," Poirot said softly, "your actions did not protect him. They only prolonged the inevitable." Lady Harrow closed her eyes as though she could not bear to hear the truth any longer. "What should I have done?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What could I have done?" Poirot paused, allowing the silence to hang in the air for a moment before answering. "You should have trusted in the law, madame. You should have trusted that justice would have found its own way, but instead you allowed yourself to be blinded by love, and that has cost more than you realize." The room was still. No one spoke for several long moments as the weight of Poirot's words sank in. Finally, Poirot turned his gaze back to Miss Montgomery. "And what of you, Miss Montgomery? Your actions were not without purpose, were they? You spoke of wanting to protect your mother, but there is more to it, is there not? A part of you knew that if this investigation continued, the truth would come out, and so you chose to remain silent, hoping that somehow the problem would resolve itself." Miss Montgomery's eyes flickered with something resembling guilt. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, she simply nodded, her face pale. Poirot's voice softened again, but his words carried the weight of finality. "You acted out of fear, Miss Montgomery. Fear for your mother, but also fear for yourself. You knew the consequences of exposing Robert Montgomery, and you understood that your life would never be the same if that truth came to light. And so, you protected him, even when you knew that his actions were inexcusable." Lady Harrow lifted her eyes to meet Poirot's, her expression a mixture of shame and confusion. "You mean, all of this pain? It was for nothing?" she asked quietly. Poirot nodded. Indeed, for nothing, except to expose the truth in the end. The room fell into another silence, the tension thick and palpable. Poirot's mind, however, was already moving on, carefully sifting through the remaining facts. He had understood for some time now that the real key to unraveling this mystery lay not in the crime itself, but in the motivations of those involved. The pieces of the puzzle were now in place, but there was one more question that needed to be answered. Who had been the one to ring the bell? It was an insignificant detail to most people, merely the sound that marked the moment of Lazenby's death. But Poirot knew better. The bell had not been an accident. It had been a signal, a sign to someone that the time had come to act. Poirot turned his attention back to the others in the room, focusing on them one by one. His eyes rested for a moment on Robert Montgomery's empty chair. It was a chair that had been conspicuously absent from the investigation until now. The man had remained a ghost, his role barely mentioned. Yet Poirot could not shake the feeling that Robert Montgomery had been at the heart of it all. And then it hit him, the connection between the bell and Robert Montgomery. "Miss Montgomery," Poirot said, his voice sharp, "tell me something. Where was your father when the bell rang?" "Can you recall? You must have heard the sound. But where was he?" Her eyes widened in surprise. "Father," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know where he was. He was never around when anything happened." Poirot's lips curved slightly as he placed the final piece of the puzzle. "Ah, but that is the key, madame. You see, Robert Montgomery was not only aware of Lazenby's death, he orchestrated it. He knew that the bell would be rung at the precise moment, and he used it as a signal to his accomplice." The room grew still once again, the weight of Poirot's words sinking in. Miss Montgomery's face twisted in confusion and realization. "But how could you know that?" Poirot's eyes gleamed as he leaned in slightly, his voice lowering to a whisper. "Because, Miss Montgomery, your father was not just a bystander. He was the one who rang the bell." The realization hit her like a physical blow. She recoiled as though she had been struck, her face pale with shock and disbelief. Poirot gave her a moment, allowing the weight of his deduction to settle before he spoke again. "The bell was not merely a signal, Miss Montgomery. It was the moment when your father sealed his fate. He used it to create a distraction, a way to cover his tracks, while his accomplice, someone very close to him, did the work." Miss Montgomery took a shaky breath, her eyes wide with the dawning understanding. "No, it wasn't him. It couldn't have been." Poirot's gaze softened. "It was. And now, madame, we must all face the truth." The silence that filled the room was almost suffocating. Miss Montgomery's expression was one of disbelief, as though her mind was struggling to process the enormity of the revelation. She shook her head slowly, a faint tremor in her hands as she clutched the edge of the chair. "No," she whispered again, this time more to herself than to Poirot. "It couldn't have been him. He wouldn't—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Poirot's gaze remained steady, though there was a slight softening in his eyes. He had seen this before. The disbelief, the denial that followed the unveiling of a truth too painful to accept. But he also knew that once the facts were laid bare, the mind had little choice but to confront them, no matter how uncomfortable or tragic they might be. "Ah, Miss Montgomery," Poirot said, his voice calm but firm. "Your father was a man of many contradictions. A man who believed he could control the world around him with his wealth, his influence, his charm. But underneath all that, there was another truth. A truth that not even he could escape. Lady Harrow, who had been silent up until now, looked up at Poirot, her expression a mixture of confusion and horror. "You mean to say, Robert did it, but how could he?" Her voice faltered, as though the question was unanswerable. Poirot turned to her with a sad yet knowing look. "Your son, madame, was a man of much ambition. He had many debts, you see, and he knew that with his reputation intact, he could leverage his position to clear them all. But Lazenby, madame, was standing in his way. Lady Harrow's breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Poirot's eyes never wavered as he took a step closer to her. Robert Montgomery had much to gain from Lazenby's death, and he knew how to orchestrate it. He had one simple but crucial tool: the bell. "But he didn't pull the trigger," Miss Montgomery interjected, her voice breaking. "You can't say he did. He wasn't there." Poirot's gaze shifted back to Miss Montgomery. "No, madam, he did not pull the trigger himself, but he was there in spirit if not in body. It was his plan, his manipulation, that set everything into motion. You see, Robert Montgomery used the bell as a signal to his accomplice." The words hit Miss Montgomery like a physical blow, and she recoiled slightly, her breath shallow. "Accomplice?" she repeated, her voice a mere whisper. Poirot nodded. Yes, and this accomplice, whom Robert trusted implicitly, was none other than his mother, your own mother, Lady Harrow. The revelation struck like a thunderclap, and for a moment there was nothing but stunned silence in the room. Lady Harrow's eyes widened, her hand rising to her lips in shock. She looked from Poirot to her daughter and back again, as if trying to piece together the unfathomable. I didn't," Lady Harrow stammered. "You must be mistaken. I couldn't have—" Poirot raised a hand, silencing her. "Please, madame, let me explain. The bell was not simply a call to action. It was a signal, as I have said, but it was also a distraction, a ruse to cover the real motive. You were the one who rang the bell, and your son knew you would." Lady Harrow's eyes flickered, a momentary look of guilt crossing her features before she quickly suppressed it. "I rang the bell," she admitted, her voice tight. "But I had no idea it was for this. Robert told me that it would signal the moment of his success, that it would be our chance to finally end the mess with Lazenby." Poirot nodded, the corners of his mouth tightening. "Exactly. You did not act with malice in your heart, but you were manipulated. Robert knew your love for him would cloud your judgment, and you allowed yourself to be a pawn in his game." There was a long pause as Lady Harrow lowered her gaze, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "I only wanted to protect him," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "He was my son." Poirot's voice softened. "And therein lies the heart of the matter, madame. It is your love for him that led you to make the choice you did. But this choice, this misguided attempt to protect him, has now led to tragedy, and I am afraid that there is no turning back." Miss Montgomery's face contorted with confusion and sorrow. "But father couldn't have been involved. He was—" she faltered. "He was in London, wasn't he?" Poirot's gaze turned steely as he fixed his attention on her. "Ah, Miss Montgomery, the truth is rarely so simple. Your father was in London, yes, but you must understand, that was part of the plan. He never intended to physically harm anyone, but he orchestrated it all. The death of Lazenby, the timing of the bell, everything." "How?" Miss Montgomery's voice cracked, her disbelief evident. "How could he?" Poirot took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before answering. "Your father, Miss Montgomery, had a network of connections, some of which you were unaware of. One of those connections was the man who rang the bell, the accomplice who executed the final part of Robert's plan. A man who had been in London the entire time, a man who had been receiving instructions from Robert via coded messages. That man was none other than your own husband, Mr. Michael Finch." The room seemed to spin around Miss Montgomery, her hands shaking as she looked from Poirot to her mother and back again. "Michael? But he was— I don't understand." Poirot's voice was sharp and resolute as he continued, "Your husband, Miss Montgomery, was the one who fired the fatal shot. Robert had carefully arranged for him to be in the right place at the right time, waiting for the bell to ring. Finch was the one who pulled the trigger, knowing exactly what was expected of him. Miss Montgomery stumbled back, her face pale with horror. "No, it's impossible. It can't be true." Poirot nodded, his expression somber. "It is true, Miss Montgomery. And now, justice must be served." For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of the truth hung in the air, a heavy, suffocating presence. Lady Harrow sat with her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly together. Miss Montgomery, meanwhile, appeared utterly shattered, her whole world upended in a single, devastating moment. Poirot watched them both for a long while, his mind working through the details once more. Everything had fallen into place. The puzzle pieces that had seemed so scattered now aligned with perfect clarity. It was a tragedy. Yes, but a tragedy that could not have been avoided, not once the path had been chosen. Finally, Poirot spoke, his voice carrying the full weight of the investigation. "I shall call the authorities, and the proper course will be followed. But let this be a lesson, madame, to you both. Nothing can remain hidden forever. The truth will always come to light." And with that, Hercule Poirot turned away from the two women, his mind already at peace with the resolution of the case. As he stepped toward the door, he turned back briefly, offering one final, reflective thought. Sometimes it is not the crime itself, but the motivations behind it that shape our destinies. With that, he left the room, and the door clicked softly behind him.